Just before 3 in the morning on December 17th, 1944, a frozen hill in the Ardennes forest, known on American maps simply as Hill 523, sat directly in the path of Hitler's final winter offensive. On the crest, buried deep in the snow, a 22-year-old first lieutenant lay flat on his stomach with binoculars pressed to his eyes. His name was Edward C. Fletcher. He was a forward observer, a combat scout trained to spot targets for the heavy artillery. He had been on this desolate hill for less than 12 hours, and he had never directed real artillery fire under combat conditions in his entire life. In the pitch blackness below the ridge, columns of elite German tanks were already moving. This sudden attack, which the world would later call the Battle of the Bulge, was Adolf Hitler's last massive gamble. It was an order straight from the German dictator to smash through the thin American lines, seize the vital bridges over the Meuse River, and split the Allied armies in two. The northern route of this massive armored breakthrough ran straight through the narrow mountain roads overlooked by Hill 523. Whoever held that high ground could see and hit absolutely anything that tried to pass. Fletcher did not yet understand the massive danger heading his way. He did not know that within 2 hours, his division's forward command post in the valley would be completely overrun. He did not know that the 700 infantrymen on the hill with him would be totally surrounded by enemy forces for 5 straight days, surviving on melted snow and rationed ammunition. He didn't even know that the 35-pound radio on his back was about to become the most important piece of equipment on the entire battlefield. He knew only one basic law. If he could see the enemy and send the coordinates, the network behind him would do the rest. Over the next 5 days, Fletcher would call in 167 different fire missions from that frozen hill. Every single radio call went back to a centralized fire direction center located 4 miles behind the front lines. Each target he spotted could be hit by a single battery of 4 guns, a full battalion of 12, or if the target was rich enough, by every single American cannon within 15 miles. This story is not just about a guy with a radio. It is about the mathematical system behind him, the forgotten engineers who built it, and how it completely shattered the finest armor of the German army. To understand the power Fletcher held on his back, you have to go back 15 years to Fort Sill, Oklahoma. In the late 1920s, while other major armies around the world were merely refining the slow, rigid artillery methods of the First World War, 3 American officers, Major Carlos Brewer, Major Orlando Ward, and Lieutenant Colonel H.L.C. Jones, quietly rewrote the rules of warfare. The official military records described their work in dry words, but what they built was a complete revolution that turned artillery from a slow craft into a lightning-fast machine. For hundreds of years, artillery had been treated like an isolated trade. Every individual gun crew only knew their own weapon, their own ranges, and their own target. If 2 different batteries wanted to shoot at the exact same crossroads, each had to calculate its own math from its own location. Because of this, the shells would land at completely different times. The first shell would hit, give away the surprise, and give the enemy infantry plenty of time to dive into deep trenches before the rest of the shells arrived. Brewer, Ward, and Jones made that reality completely obsolete. They created the Fire Direction Center, a small room away from the battlefield filled with maps, slide rules, and a few men who were very good at math. The men in this room held a master map showing the exact location of every single American gun and every reported enemy target. When an observer on a hill radioed in a target, he didn't need to know where the guns were, and the gunners didn't need to see what they were shooting at. The center sat in the middle and solved the geometry for everyone at once. Using a newly invented slide rule tool called a graphical firing table, a clerk could calculate complex firing data in less than 30 seconds. The other half of the breakthrough was the radio itself. In the 1930s, the U.S. Army invested heavily in frequency-modulated or FM combat radios. These radios were completely resistant to the static and bad weather that ruined older AM radios in rough terrain. When Lieutenant Fletcher spoke into his handset in the middle of a blizzard, his voice came through crystal clear. The man who championed this entire system was Lieutenant Colonel Leslie J. McNair, who made sure this math and radio system became standard doctrine for the whole Army. In a tragic twist of fate, McNair was killed by misdirected American bombs in Normandy in July 1944. He never lived to see his system perform at its absolute peak. The ultimate weapon this system created was a technique called time on target. The Fire Direction Center would calculate the exact flight time of a shell from every different battery at various distances. A gun far away might take 40 seconds to hit the target, while a closer gun might only take 20 seconds. The center would synchronize the countdown perfectly, telling each battery to fire at a slightly different second. The result was terrifying. Dozens of shells from completely different locations would land on the exact same spot at the exact same millisecond. There was no warning shot. 1 second there was absolute silence. The next, an entire field turned into a roaring wall of exploding steel. The world first saw what this system could do at the Battle of El Guetar in the Tunisian desert in March 1943. Weeks earlier, the green, untrained American army had been badly beaten by Rommel's veteran tank divisions at Kasserine Pass. European commanders openly mocked American coordination. El Guetar was the reckoning. When German tanks attacked, American observers didn't run. They hid in small holes and kept calling the fire direction centers. The centers pooled every gun in the area and systematically tore the German tanks to pieces. General George Patton, watching the destruction, turned to his artillery commander and said, "You taught me something today. The artillery won this fight." To make the system work, the artillery also needed eyes in the sky. This led to the introduction of the Piper L-4 Grasshopper, a small, slow, completely unarmed civilian scout plane flown by artillery lieutenants who spoke the exact same technical language as the men on the ground. From 1,500 feet in the air, these pilots could look behind hills, spot hidden German convoys, and call the big guns directly. According to official records, whenever a Grasshopper plane appeared overhead, German artillery completely stopped shooting. They knew that if they fired a single shot, the little plane would spot them and American guns would wipe them out within 3 minutes. If this deep dive into the engineering of history brings value to your screen, a simple like ensures this record remains visible to those who study the evolution of strategy. Let us return to the snow. By the morning of December 18th, the situation on Fletcher's Hill was desperate. The elite 2nd SS Panzer Division had completely surrounded the ridge. Every normal infantry communication line to the rear was cut. The only thread keeping 700 American soldiers alive was the radio frequency on Fletcher's back. He keyed the mic and called in an enemy coordinate. 5 miles away, in a log bunker, the calculations room plotted the target. The battalion commander gave the famous 3-word reply that became a mantra over the airwaves, "On the way," and the rounds came. It was here at Elsenborn Ridge that the Americans dropped their greatest technological secret onto the battlefield, the VT proximity fuse. It was a tiny radar transmitter packed into the nose of an artillery shell. As the shell hurtled toward the earth, it constantly sent out a signal. The moment it detected the ground exactly 20 feet away, it exploded automatically in midair. Before this battle, General Eisenhower had strictly banned its use on land, terrified that a dud would fall into German hands and be copied. But with the German army threatening to break the Allied lines, the restrictions were lifted. The combination of time on target and the proximity fuse was devastating. Shells no longer buried themselves in the mud before exploding. Instead, they burst directly over the open German foxholes, raining millions of sharp steel fragments downward onto soldiers who had absolutely no overhead cover. The men in the holes, who in earlier wars had been almost untouchable by indirect fire, were now completely exposed to a weapon designed to kill them where they stood. The absolute terror of this system is preserved in history. Writing after the war in an American military journal, defeated German General Karl Thoholte wrote with total honesty that the American artillery concentrations were accurate, flexible, and delivered with terrifying speed. He noted that in technology the American excelled, and that the standardization of weapons, the quality of communication equipment, and the instantaneous massing of fire were completely superior. He wasn't writing propaganda. He was a professional admitting that the Americans had turned the chaotic art of war into a highly efficient automated factory.
What truly set the American approach apart wasn't just the technology, but where the authority to use it resided. In the British and German armies, a request for massive artillery fire had to climb up a rigid ladder of high-ranking command posts. By the time an army commander signed off on the request, the target was usually gone. The American military pushed that absolute authority down to the lowest level. A 21-year-old lieutenant on a hill held the keys to an entire army corps' firepower. If he needed more guns, the control room handed them to him in seconds. By March the 24th, 1945, during the crossing of the Rhine River, the machine reached its absolute industrial peak. A single American field army deployed over 2,000 heavy artillery guns, served by 40,000 men. In just 1 hour of preparation, those guns fired over 65,000 rounds across the river. The system that a few instructors had sketched on a chalkboard during the Great Depression had become an industrial weapon, capable of dissolving an enemy force in an hour. Yet, at the very center of that massive wheel stood the exact same figure. A lone lieutenant with a pair of binoculars and a radio on his back. Lieutenant Edward C. Fletcher survived the freezing hell of Hill 523 and returned home to a quiet civilian life, leaving his name in the dry morning after-action reports. The infantry companies who shielded his radio took the true weight of the casualties. Over half of them never walked off that ridge. But they bought the vital time needed for the American army to dig in and win the battle. If someone in your family tree bore the weight of this war, no matter their branch, their unit, or their theatre, leave their identity in the comments below. The names are fading from living memory, and we write them here to keep them anchored. Subscribe for more deep histories of strategy. Until the next grid coordinate, stand easy.